It is 6:36. The school committee, we're going to call the school committee to order.
Call Selectboard to order.
Okay. We don't yet have,
You're not calling your order.
Well, I can probably it's missing for lack of a quorum.
all right. So tonight we're going to have our follow-up meeting to the joint meeting that we started a few weeks ago. And I think many of us left that meeting hopeful that we started having the right conversation, and we are looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have this evening. It turns out it wasn't really convenient for the schedules of the Finance Committee members, so we currently have only Bob representing the Finance Committee, and thank you for that, Bob. So to the extent that it's possible, we're going to continue this conversation. So if at one point we decide that we need to have more conversations, that's fine, but let's see how far we get, at least with two committees having their quorum. And I know that Deanne's going to join us a little later this evening, then maybe we can catch up separately or in a different meeting with the Finance Committee as well. So what we are hoping to accomplish today is really lay out the same themes that we talked about last time, and at least try to get to the point where we address or begin addressing the short-term budget issues of the school district. But that said, I think one of the positive outcomes, positive sounds of the last meeting was the fact that we talked about having a plan. We talked about having a long-term plan and potentially looking at this problem as a town problem, which is something that we really love hearing. You can tell from the setting that we had high expectations about participation, about the audience. The camera doesn't see it, but we don't have as many people, but we are still in our gym. Hopefully folks will have an opportunity to watch this. With that, I would like to remind everyone that despite the fact that we are here all together and we're talking about the budget, this is not our public hearing. Our public hearing is on April 30th here at the high school, which also means that this is a business meeting for all of us. And therefore, there is really no public comment section to this particular meeting. We're going to turn the floor to you, to those of you who will be present at the public hearing, for your comments, questions at the public hearing when we reconvene on April 30th. So with that, I will try to do a very quick recap of what we talked about or what we heard, and I will just open it to everyone, basically. We all seem to have agreed that we have a funding problem with respect to our school budgets. In fact, if I put it in somewhat of a better problem statement, based on the numbers that I was able to see, the last 5 years, the budget gap for the Granby Public Schools was on average $650,000 compared to the town funding formula that we have been talking about. And that really excludes a lot of the initial funding that was there for investment in things like technology or 21st century classroom and being able to get to a point where we could get creative. So the last 5 years we're looking at a similar type of budget gap annually. Doesn't mean that every year we got that amount. Each one of those years we had very difficult conversations, and each one of those years we at times got some funding from the town, and at times we could not get the funding that we asked for. So we try to make sure that we've reduced our budget in a reasonable way to be able to continue to offer the education that the students in this district deserve. But we now are saying that there is really no reasonable cut that can be made. The conversations from this point on will be even more difficult. So how do we look at this problem? Any budget gap can have at least two branches to it, I guess. One is the revenue side. Either we are able to increase our revenue or find some funding sources, or we look at the expense side or cost side and see how we can reduce the expenses and costs. That expense side has been what we focused on the last so many years. That's why when you look at it, we deferred a good number of line items that we had in our budgets the last 7, 8 years or more. We reduced the number of teachers, we reduced the number of staff members, the custodial staff. We reduced some of the contract services that we were getting only so many years ago. So we tried to really address the problem primarily by looking at the expense side of the equation. What we heard last time when we had our joint meeting was that maybe we want to look at the funding side or revenue side a little more carefully as well. And with that, we even split that into two pieces. We said there is need to have conversation around short-term funding, and then potentially we have that opportunity to look at this as a macro issue that involves the entire town of Granby, in which case we're going to treat it as a long-term problem as well, and we're going to possibly convene a group of individuals who can look at those opportunities as well. So my preference personally, and doesn't mean that it has to hold anyone, would be really focus on that side, continue to focus on that side. And since we don't want to be here all night, and if anybody's interested, that would be fine as well, we may want to start our conversation with that short-term funding, which is a more immediate need from our school's perspective. If there are any other suggestions, any other ways to approach it, we are open to that as well, since this is our joint meeting. So that is my quick recap of what I think we talked about last time, and I will turn it to anyone else who would like to add anything to that. Then maybe we can focus on one of those items and go from there.
I just think with our short-term suggestions for funding, I think we need to come up with several of them. We just can't have one that gets it. I think that's what we got to look at as a group. What are our possibilities that we have, and what's feasible? I'm sorry, I'm a soft-spoken person. Just kind of look at what our possibilities are as to fund something for a short time, and what's feasible, and get to that point. And if we can't, reality is we don't have control over everything. The town has control of that. So how do we look at that where it is something feasible for the town to say yes, and they like that as well? Because as we said, it is a town issue. This affects the whole entire town, regardless how you look at it. And I understand that myself. So, for suggestions, I know we all talk about, well, we could take money from here, and here. But what are those suggestions besides just taking it from, if you will, our savings account?
Yeah.
What are our options?
So, if you're asking us,
I'm asking the group, everybody that's
Okay.
here.
obviously, when we're talking about short term, that is with the understanding that we are not able to generate additional revenue in that short
Right.
term. So we are looking at those sources that are available to us. And when we look at that, we're coming back to the same sources that we've been talking about for a while. And that could be anywhere from, free cash, stabilization, override, any one of those would be options, right? The one thing that we did not necessarily do over the course of so many years is something that Bob mentioned at the last meeting. How do we, having a savings account is fine. It's obviously, it's good for us to have funds to fall back to if something happens. From a little more tactical perspective, we are kind of trying to respond to some recommendation from the Department of Revenue as well that says, yeah, you should really, save some of your revenue and make sure that it is put aside. I guess the question becomes, what is the plan for us in this next so many years for all those funds? And is it possible to really see a portion of those funds, at the very least, to be used for the schools until we find that footing where we are continuing on the trend that we're seeing, especially on the elementary school side? The enrollment is now catching up, it is increasing. How do we really build on that? And how do we invest in that momentum with the existing funding sources? So the plan is something that we can talk about. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether it's percentages of certain types of savings, whether it's, for so many years we may be considering a certain number of dollars. That's, I guess, open to suggestions. But probably the quickest answer to your question, since we're talking short term, I am thinking about the existing funds at this point, existing sources at this point.
One of the things, this is somewhat long range, but I think it's the context that we have to look at the funding of our schools. We know almost 50% or 55%, somewhere around that, comes from the state. At the state level, this is what they are planning. Legislature is planning on this fair share amendment going through because they do not want to raise taxes on their own. They would much rather have voters do it. That's a huge thing. It still has to get through. It's working its way through the Supreme Court now on what if anything, might not be like constitutionally kosher. But one of the ways I look at this year is that we're trying to basically try to bridge the gap between now and that, even though the fair share amendment is not a guarantee. We don't know how much money we would actually see from it, but that's how I would kind of frame this year. Is, we still have a gap, but the gap is not just on the town side; it's also on the state side. And at the state, there's a good chance the state will basically be giving us more money. However, there's still timing issues. We don't know if that tax goes into effect, when it'll go into effect, how much revenue there will be, and when it'll actually be able to impact our budget. It might not even be until not this fiscal year, but the next fiscal year. So there are still questions about that, but I think we have to look at that as part of the context for puzzle of our long-term budget.
That and the Chapter 70 funding formula being reworked should result into more revenues coming in. So we potentially have 3 new sources of revenue coming in the schools, which is the increase in Chapter 70, an increase in our school population. I mean, we've got a lot of kids who want to come in. We've got lots of families moving into town. So that's all awesome. Great news for the schools. And then, like you said, the fair share tax. So we have potentially 3 sources of revenue coming towards the school system over the next few years. It's just, we have to just get there. You just have to make it there. And if we keep having the same headlines in the newspapers and the same problem happening year after year, people aren't going to want to put their kids in these schools. And now we're shooting ourselves in the foot by killing a potential big chunk of change that we're just not in a position to say no to. For the town or for the schools. If we make cuts according to where we're at today, we will see a mass exodus of students. I really believe that. It just doesn't look good that we're not doing this. So this meeting is wonderful, and we're all very thankful for it. And we hope we can fix this for even just, like we said, short term, 2-3 years, we see a big change coming. But we need to embrace this time right now. I think we're really at that critical.
And I think we have a good opportunity with new school opening in September, so.
Absolutely.
So on that new school side, remember last time when we met, we said, and correct me if which were the numbers? I think our estimate for kindergarten next year for next school year was 48. Then we had, between then and now, we have 5 more students coming. So even during that short time period, we have 5 additional students coming into kindergarten. Obviously, the school itself attracts a lot of new students, new families. I don't recall if you said that they're all new residents of the town or schools. And that's another thing that we're seeing, the trend that there are new school-age students coming in. That also helped us increase the share of town school-age students in our school districts, which has been in this precipitous decline for a while. Now it's coming up. We were having a conversation earlier today. If we can bring it back to where it was, say, 5 years ago, which is around mid-80s, that alone actually helps us a great deal. But at the same time, it also allows us to be able to say, hey, we have capacity and we can really do a lot of good things in our district. The challenge with the funding, the foundation formula is that the formula is almost fully updated. It's been presented, 2 years ago, maybe more, to the legislative body, and everybody's okay with it. They don't have funds for it. So chances are part of the fair share, if it passes, will be used for the foundation formula. But then if you have so much more, maybe the foundation formula will not be the adequate one. Another thing in the short to mid-term that may pan out is something that Cheryl's been part of, which is the Rural School, what we call it?
Rural Schools Coalition.
Rural Schools Coalition. And this is a number of schools that got together several years ago. The superintendent from Mohawk is leading that effort. And it is really gaining a lot of momentum. And the premise of that is we are not going through the same economic and financial experiences as most other towns to our west. This is not a traditional east-west conversation. This is fact-based. The fact that we don't really have the same economic structure, we don't have the same means to be able to continuously fund the schools. So there is a very interesting formula that many legislators currently are supporting for rural school districts. And Granby is considered the level 3 on that one. So depending on how rural you're considered, they divide it into 3 layers. We're considered level 3, but even at level 3, they do provide additional assistance, or they do propose additional assistance per pupil, which again could bring funds. The key, I believe, is what Jen said. We are looking at all these possibilities, and we've been. How do we really get there without really straining the school district beyond what we already have during the last so many years?
All right, so we're talking now about practical.
Practical.
All right. So we signed our warrant, town meeting warrant, both town meeting warrants, annual and the special one coming up. I believe Chris was able to come up with, so we'll talk just for people who might be listening. We have the foundation budget, which is in the minimum required spending. Then there's also that $305,000 that's been, I don't know, that was a long time ago.
That was an override vote from
Override
2004.
vote.
From
Yeah.
2004.
So, and I think, based on our discussions on Monday, we were able to come up with $200,000 more. $200,000 more to add to the foundation plus the 300,000.
Okay.
So that brings us up to 200,000 above the 2 things.
Right. So
So that's one concrete step.
yep. So just quickly, and I want you to continue on that. What that means, because 305,000 as an override is already baked into that budget that has the $682,000 currently, right?
Correct.
Gap. So the $200,000 basically brings us to that $400,000 to $480,000 range. That's what it means. So just to put it in perspective.
I don't know what perspective you're talking about.
What he's saying is the gap, original gap of 682 is now 482.
Because you're saying that there's
Yep.
additional $200,000.
Okay.
So I guess I would say too, so I know we sat down and we did ask Chris to look at any means possible, and that's what he said, and looking at the funding for the town, looks like we could add additional $200,000. And as I say we, I mean the town, where he feels comfortable enough where knowing what the revenue coming in is estimated at, that's what the town will be afforded to, additional funds. If I'm wrong, Chris,
No, you're right.
please step in. So I guess where I would think too, is there anything the school can do as far as make any type of cuts so we can get to closer, the middle, if you will? And I say that out of respect, that, because we're looking at options, and the option is, going to the town and asking, out of the stabilization fund of another $402,000 to fund completely where we want it to be. And I guess my fear, one of the fears, is that, not the fear that it passes, but it does pass, and a year later, we're sitting there saying, well, we didn't, the fair share amendment didn't pass, or it passed, and it's not gonna take effect as such and such, so now we're at like, well, what do we do now? So now we borrowed that 400,000, and now we're looking at a deeper hole a year from now. And do those cuts become drastic a year from now, versus now we can weather them a little bit and kind of meet in the middle, and maybe go to the town asking for a little bit less money to get us to that next step next year. Because if something we can't forecast out next year. We don't know what happens, as well as the state doesn't know what's going to happen. So if things don't go the way we hope, and we're up against, financial situations again, I think it's difficult to keep on going and asking and asking and asking. To what point do we don't have that money? So I don't know where we can, I guess I'm just asking, is there anything that we can get together closer to the middle, where, the town's gonna feel comfortable saying, yes, I think that's okay? Because my other fear is that, we bring it to the town floor and it doesn't pass, and then, it gets to be put on a ballot and it doesn't pass again, and here comes those drastic cuts again.
Right.
Which I would hate to see.
Yeah. Do you want to take that? No? So, I'm asking Cheryl because at the end of the day, she is the person in charge of the school district, so I don't want to really assume that role, but as a member of the school committee, and based on the numbers that we have in our budget, what we would probably look at upfront would be those things that are additional. That is, we're not necessarily cutting something in existence. We're basically looking at things that we have been deferring for the last 3 or 4 years. Some of them, believe it or not, they don't sound critical, but they are critical. I wish there was a way for us to explain it better. Maybe we are not really articulating it as well as we could or we should. But a data manager, for instance, becomes a very critical role because the state is now data crazy, and on top of that, all the standardized tests are going to be offered through electronic means. So if you look at those two tasks alone, forget about everything else that, you have all the numbers through your payroll, through everything that are, it is a single person who's doing all that in our district. So with that, the last so many years, we've been proposing to add that role. But that is one of the additional roles that we added this year. Probably that would be something that we'll look at. The other thing is, because we are, and stop me at any point if I speak out of turn.
Speak on your behalf.
The other thing that we added was this shared curriculum director, which is, again, it sounds like, okay, why can't you guys put your own curriculum together? Aren't you the educators? That is critical in terms of being able to align anywhere from pre-K through senior grade, 12th grade, so that all these kids have an experience that gradually enriches what they are getting, and they are getting out and graduating with that experience. It's something that most school districts are able to do because, they are able to do. So the reason why we emphasize that word shared in front of it, after talking about it for years, we were able to get into some conversation with a couple of other districts, and we were able to fund a position that would be shared between those 3 districts. So it's not the full cost, we're basically sharing that role, but if it comes to that role doesn't exist, it is probably easier to look at those roles that do not have an individual behind them to begin with. I don't remember what the total for those were.
That's $73,000.
$73,000 for those 2. Probably would be something that we would look at. Again, it has to be discussed by the full committee. But I want to also look at the other side of it. Remember that town meeting that we had, special town meeting, where we had unexpected expenses? Special education, and then there was a 2nd grade teacher who is now absolutely needed because the numbers are increasing on the elementary side. So those 3 elements have been pulled into the school budget because we had to. Last time it was unanticipated, yes, but now it is anticipated, so they have to be pulled. And the total of those 3 items, 3 line items,
9751.
Yeah, I
is that
got
what it
that.
was? Okay.
9751.
Well, the
About
tuition
$100,000,
is, so,
right?
and then the
170
transition is
closer.
20,
170?
yeah,
So,
It
plus
was
the
97 plus 51 plus
20.
20.
20, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
about
170.
170.
So $170,000 is actually what we kind of integrated into the budget from that time. So we're talking about $200,000, and believe me, at least from my perspective, I would not say that it's not appreciated that you guys started the conversation with that. It is great. It's just that I'm also trying to explain that a great percentage of that amount was already spoken for even when we started this conversation. So that's what it's going to allow us to do. The rest of it has to come out of somewhere that I don't know where. The mandated items have to stay because they're mandated. Then we would start looking at everything else. And I cannot tell you from the top of my head what those items would be, except for those 2 positions that I just mentioned.
Yeah, I agree, and I think everything on your budget is very important. Having 2 kids, one that's gone through the school system, one that's in there now, I think everything you do have, I think it's important. But also, as I said, reality is, I know last year that, when we were looking for an override, that got denied, it got passed, so my fear is that, what happens this year? And if the same thing repeats itself, then we're in a much worse position than we are sitting here right now. So, and I guess, in a way, speaking to the town, and I use this as saying as, showing good faith that we're trying to do what we possibly can so we can make it to that next spot that we think we're going to be available, next year or the year after, we're going to make it. Because also, you talk about the enrollment that it's going up. Well, that's great, but we got to keep those kids here.
Yeah.
So I mean, to me, is how do we, we talk about bridging the gap, and then how do we bridge the gap for the next couple of years, but also being respectful, because I hate to see, and I say it because just looking at past history, and I'll say it again, is that got voted down. How do we present this to the town to say this is what we need, and this is a good thing, to have people vote on it, so it's going to work? You know, that's just, I hate for it to come back to the school and say, look, that got that got turned down on the floor. Okay, well, we'll put it on the pallet for an override. Well, that got turned down. Well, now you gotta figure out $400,000.
Right.
And then to me, that's just scary. It really is. And I think, like I said, somehow look at where it could be somehow speaking to the town as far as, you know, good faith. We're trying to get to that next tier, if you will. You know, how are we gonna get there? And, okay, we can, as you said, Emery, hey, you know what, there are a couple of things that are proposed, but maybe we can push those off to next year. Not saying they're not needed this year, because obviously they are, but again, is it something that we can wait till next year, and hopefully we're in a better situation where we can say, okay, we made it, now we can breathe a little bit easier and take on a little bit more.
Right.
I think the goal, this is how the goal as I see it is, we're not gonna race across the finish line, but we wanna be able to limp across the finish line. We don't wanna like drop
Yeah.
10 yards before and not finish the race. I think one of the things we talked about for a source was some of the mandatory costs from this year. We're gonna use some of the reserve fund, I think, for that. Is it correct?
Yes.
Now, is that part of the 600 or whatever you guys are talking about, or not?
That's
still this-
the two FY 2018 expenses that were addressed at the February
All
town
right,
meeting.
so 600,000
The
or
teacher,
whatever is
the
for
special ed placement, and the transitional services.
is 18, 19.
19.
So it's kind of immaterial. It just comes
Yeah.
up the next thing. I mean, sources, what, you can take it from, like Jim stated it fairly bluntly last time. You can take it from other departments, you can take it from stabilization funds. And I don't think that the town at this point has done, since I've been here, since I've been in Selectboard, we've done 2 overrides for more than 10% of a tax increase. I don't really think that this townspeople are gonna vote for an override. That would help the schools that much, because you're really talking about I don't know, probably talking about a 5% tax increase to like come up with the money you need, 4 or 5%. So I mean, that leaves stabilization. I mean, that's really where it's at.
So if you were to ask me, the override may or may not make sense. In one way, it always sounded reasonable, and I can agree with that side, which is, hey, you know, you ask folks if they are willing to take additional property tax increase, and then we build it based on that. But what we are seeing with respect to override, same story on that $305,000 override that we had. That amount may be more than needed, less than needed. It doesn't really fluctuate. It's the same thing year after year. I mean, last time we tried to speak about the fact that what you could buy for $305,000 in 2005, which was the first fiscal year, I think, where we had that amount, and today, they're drastically different. You have to spend $450,000 to be able to buy, or something close to that, to be able to buy what $305,000 was able to buy then. So the override has that negative side to it as well. What I am looking at is this. So every year we're generating free cash. Free cash is based on tax revenue that we're generating that is not necessarily used.
Not budgeted,
Pardon me?
not budgeted.
Not budgeted?
Free
Yes,
cash
not budgeted,
is
yes.
actual revenues over in excess of budget.
In excess of the budgeted items.
Yes.
So there is a percentage that we seem to be successfully generating, which is a great thing. What I am seeing and hearing, and based on my conversations, understanding, is that many towns are having these types of conversations beforehand, and then they look at the needs of the schools and having this exact conversation. You know, what is it that you guys can do, and what are the critical ones, what should be kept, what should not? And part of that free cash gets allocated to the extent that it's possible, and, you know, if something happens and we cannot, to either to a fund or to the school budget. My understanding is that, for instance, Belchertown does it that way. They just, they convene before their town meeting. The intent is this. Whenever we get into the conversation that says, well, we have this much money, which is understood, available for all these departments, and who's going to give up something and so somebody else can pick up that amount, it turns into this who needs more. And we don't really believe that we are those in a position to tell any other department that they don't need that. Just like you were saying that obviously schools need it, but I'm not going to tell the police department, highway department, and other departments that, hey guys, your work is not as important and you should not get this amount. Obviously they are asking for those budgets based on reasonable assumptions and what expectations they have for the next fiscal year as well. Until we get to a point where we can make that long-term revenue generation a possibility, is there a way for us to combine two different sides? And this is what I've been thinking for a while. One is there a way to really get into a plan, as Bob was talking about last time, that says this is the tax revenue that we generate, and it is such percentage of our budget. I think it's about 6.6 to 6.7% of our budget the last several years, with the exception of 2016, fair to say? Something like that. So let's say we say, I'm just making all these things up. Not the numbers, but the whole scenario. So let's say we say, out of the 6-point-something percentage point that we are saving with respect to our budget, we want to put 5%, wherever we want to put it, stabilization, reserve funds, whatever we want to put it. The rest of it, we want to invest in the schools. Then we can also have the conversation that says, hey guys, you've been talking about this momentum, the enrollment's increasing, and we're talking about rural schools and the fair share, whatever it is. What is happening with that? Then we can say, hey, this happened, that didn't happen. Expectations met, unmet, we're going up, we're going down. We can have this conversation year after year and make different decisions based on that. If, 5 years down the road, we say, you know what, there is really nothing else, and we are really in a position where we cannot any longer sustain the school district this way, that's a good conversation to have. But again, currently the short-term question is, how do we get to that point where we expect the school district is likely to be a lot more stable than it has been and it is today, and it gets to a point where it is, through enrollment increase and these additional funds that we're expecting, it's going to allow us not to have these drastic conversations, but easier conversations, because the schools are able to generate a good chunk of their own revenue. We're not there yet. We're not going to be there for a while. All I'm asking is for creative ideas, suggestions, plans, multi-pronged approaches, short-term, mid-term, long-term, to see how we can continuously check where we are, our status, but also invest in the school district based on a plan, not just say, this year we want $500,000, next year we want $1 million, next year we want... What is that plan? Can we put together something that we can all agree on? Chris already agreed, see?
I saw him nod.
No,
I look like a nod.
the issue is this then, right? Okay, we still have a lot of things in the fire. Pilot payments from solar fields being developed in the town of Granby. Okay? The planning board just approved a 3.8 or 3.98 megawatt facility on Noodle Road and Morgan Street. We're currently going to bring at the special town meeting the ability to enter into a pilot agreement with that. That's going to generate maybe $40,000 a year in pilot payments, over and above what we have now. We have the solar fields out on East Street, bringing in maybe $30,000, $35,000 a year. That's money that could potentially be programmed in. I know the Energy Committee has been pushing, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, the SMART program, which is a program that we would develop town-owned land into solar fields. That could potentially bring in additional money of pilot payments also. So there's a lot of things that are in the works, but we can't commit the money because we don't know if we're going to get it at this point in time. But those are potential revenue sources we're trying to work on to try and give us more revenue. Okay? We can't budget every penny that we get in revenue from a prior year to the next year. You run the risk of a revenue deficit. And DOR frowns on that very, very.
Right, we don't want to run deficit.
Yeah.
But here's my question, Chris. I mean, there are different ways you can approach this, right? Or we can approach this. One is, are we able to take advantage of the funds that are being generated already, which free cash and all that comes, into play, right? The other side is, can we increase taxes? That is not,
Increasing taxes is probably the worst avenue to go down.
right? So, and I would agree with that. But when you think about it, the fact is this. Free cash is generated based on taxes, right?
Not necessarily.
Well, we're taxing people.
There's two prongs in how free cash is generated.
Right,
One, if you get actual revenues in excess of budgeted,
yeah,
and you spend less expenditures than what was budgeted,
okay,
okay? Those two items join together to make free cash. As long as all our special revenues and grants and all the other accounts stay in the positive, we get free cash. Anytime we have a negative grant balance, negative special revenue account balance, negative school lunch, whatever, that reduces free cash,
yeah,
okay? We were lucky this year to have over $1 million in free cash, but I'm programming it to try and go against replacing the school roof here. Because it said borrowing. Well, borrowing is just going to increase the cost over a period of time, because now you're in a deficit situation in future years to pay that debt.
yeah,
Where if I can pay cash right now, have a brand-new roof, new skylights, new ventilation system for the school, that takes care of a large expenditure that now, future free cash may be able to be programmed to the schools, okay? That's the problem that I run into,
yeah,
okay?
understood. A question on that one, I'm glad you brought that up. We were talking about borrowing for the roof and not spending cash. I forget the program's name, what is state something?
State house bonds,
What is it?
the state house bond program?
Are you familiar with that?
Which one?
State house bond program that?
Yeah.
Is it something that kind of mitigates that?
No, not really, not really. Basically, you're borrowing on the back of the state. That's what you're doing with the state house bond program.
But does it potentially reduce the interest that we would pay on the borrowed
But it
amount?
reduces,
Otherwise, I have to
it'll
go
end
to a
up
bank.
reducing our cherry sheet numbers, because they charge us back if we go through the state to do the borrowing. And we probably wouldn't qualify because we have such a great bond rating. We have a AA plus, which would probably prevent us from going through the state house bond program.
So is the state house bond thing basically borrowing their credit rating?
It's borrowing because you can't borrow due to your poor credit rating. You borrow based upon the state's credit rating. That's what you end up doing with that program.
Okay.
Okay?
Obviously, if your rating is better than the state's,
Yeah.
you're gonna end up, you'll be paying more to go with the state.
Right, right. That's the issue. And a roof replacement can, I think, be borrowed for no more than 10 years, is it, Steve?
I think the new regulations.
Yeah, I think it's 10 years. So we can go and bond it. You know, that's the problem, is bonding is like we did for the school, which is a 25-year repayment, because it's such a huge sum of money, you want to be able to spread it out. But to issue the bond, it cost us about $100,000, I think it was.
Closer to 160.
Okay? So those are costs that have to be budgeted in at the same time.
Do you know from the top of your head, and if you
Oh, don't ask me
that's-
from the
that's
top of
fine.
my head.
I can stand up and
Well,
The bottom of your head?
So those two components of free cash,
Yes.
do you know what percentage is on the, not unspent, but generated beyond side?
For when?
For this year, for-
It's a moving target, to be
Yeah.
honest with you.
on average, is it,
We have a warm winter.
Yeah.
I budget $150,000, say, for snow removal. We have a warm winter, very few snowstorms, very few ice storms. I mean, I only spend 60, 70,000 of it. Now I have another 80,000 that now turns into free cash at the end of the year. My diesel budget, because I'm planning on the trucks being out there and plowing, 24-hour storms. I'm expecting them to do road work. We don't end up doing that. An $80,000 budget could end up being 50. There's another 30,000. It's by the various budgetary items, okay? Our retirement assessment. We have two options, to do a 2 payment or a 1 payment. If we don't have cash to make the 1 payment, we can't save the 2.5% on the actual amount. If we have significant cash flow to be able to pay it in July, we save 2.5% on the assessment. But that all goes back to how much cash we have in the bank at that point in time. Okay, so there's a lot of factors when you're budgeting for the worst-case scenario, all of a sudden, it works out nicely. Okay? I can't really give you a number
Yeah.
off,
Is
but-
there a planned portion to free cash?
No.
Do we say, hey,
No.
we're gonna?
No.
No, there
No.
isn't.
No, I don't, I don't budget for a planned portion to have 300,000 generated or 400,000. This year, the other kicker was that why we had such a good one is because we had those 3 large deficits. We had the school lunch deficit, we had the school choice deficit, and we had circuit breaker deficit that the town voted to fund. Those negative amounts now disappeared in reducing our free cash. So now, that was probably about, 400,000, maybe almost 500,000, I think, in those 3 funds, by the time we got done adding them all together. So that is 300,000 of the free cash that was generated this year. And that's what happens. If we have a large deficit in some grant or some other special revenue, yeah, free cash is going to tank. But if we turn around and correct it in the next year, then that free cash goes higher in the subsequent year. That's why free cash is always such a moving target.
Yeah.
You
That's
know?
why I was saying that, maybe a formula, whatever it is,
1%?
depending on the.
1%?
It could be 1%, I mean, it could, whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
Based on that, if there is, there is a way to use some of that money for a agreed-upon period, not forever, to support the school budget, and then, we check it every year. I mean, I'm not even saying that this should be, hey, we decide the next 10 years we're going to do. It can be something that, we check every year and see whether or not it's even working. It may not. I mean, in our case, it may work for another town, but we try it, and it may not. Then we'll look for some other ways. But that seems to be, I agree with you, that especially since now our tax rate is $19.93 per thousand, is that what it is? So we don't really want to, increase it beyond that, it's understood. But given that at least, the last couple of years, we've been lucky enough to have that 1.1 million, then 1.4 million this year, free cash generated, I'm thinking, hey, if things go well, and if we do not just say this amount, but a percentage, could that be a source until we stabilize and then?
Well, then let me follow up this question. Do you want me, as the budgeting officer for the Board of Selectmen, to try and plan a certain amount of free cash each year?
Yeah. Would you do that, with Cheryl? Because, we basically approve it, we own it, but, you guys know your own budgets and you know how to do these things, so if that's the suggestion, yes.
I'm just asking, because if that's the case, then we really have to look at how things are
Everybody's
being
good with
done.
that?
That'd be great.
You know,
Could you repeat that, please? What you said in the, Chris, could you repeat what you just stated?
I was asking, because Emory had put out the option of using a percentage of free cash every year to fund the school budget, I asked, does the 3 boards who are here tonight want me to budget an amount that we know we won't spend to generate a certain level of free cash on an annual basis? Okay? That's what we said, right?
Yes, that's what I was saying.
I certainly believe that would be a feasible situation for all committees right here to actually invest in. I certainly do believe, I think I've expressed myself once before, that being placed in a position of this nature needs to somewhat be lulled every single time you go to town meeting. And I think there should be a feasible way of conducting business like this and moving on forward and actually getting a percentage. That would be a viable way of conducting business for the school department.
I mean, obviously, our approach is not, this is what it is, and there is no conversation. And I'm glad that you put it the way you did, Glenn, that, what are we doing on both sides? There is the revenue side, there is the expense side. What are we doing to become more efficient? And we always have these conversations. So let me give you the situation the last so many years. And even that would not stop us from looking at opportunities, because every organization changes. And organizations transform, and then they realize that certain things maybe not needed, but then you have new needs. I mean, that's why we're talking about technology as opposed to so many other things that we were talking about maybe 10 years ago. So the needs change, the focus changes, but if something is no longer needed at the level it was, then, there is always a good conversation to be had. 65% of our budget currently is salaries. And if you look at the numbers, and my approach year after year was, don't even let me give you numbers. Look at the yearbook from 5-6 years ago and yearbook from the current year, and you're going to see that there are so many folks who are currently not in our school district who were here so many years ago, because we reduced the number of teachers, we reduced the number of staff, and all those stuff that I mentioned. Yet you see that we are still trying to offer not even equal, but we're trying to offer more. I mean, you hear the AP classes increasing. You hear that we're trying to take advantage of virtual high school. We're trying to send our kids to work study programs so that they can study here, but also take advantage of some vocational possibilities out there if they don't want to go to a vocational school, right? So we're experimenting with those things. That's one side of it. The other side of it is all the mandated things that we don't really have much control over. And I asked Mark today what is the latest percentage of special ed in our budget, and he told me that it's 15.5% of our budget, special education. Of that, so it's $1.4 million, and of the $1.4 million, 66% is the amount that we are mandated to spend on students who are going outside our district. So it's not unusual. I mean, unfortunately, as we always say, the state put every district in this situation, but districts like ours, we get hurt even more because we have all these mandates that we have to respond to. So when you put those together, over 80% of our budget is really going to some efficiently planned, or that's what we're trying to do, staff plus special education. Does it mean, is there room to play with other things? We always look for those. I mean, is there a way to change certain things and not spend funds for this, maybe spend it for something else instead of asking for additional funds to be able to bring certain things to our school? Yes, we're looking at those. And we would continue at those. That should be our goal. That's what I'm suggesting, that it is never one and done. And I agree with Steve that this should be the type of conversation that we have every year to see where we are, what we're able to do, what we were able to accomplish, and what else is possibly available within the town and outside the town. I wish Rob was here, because I was going to put him on the spot, just like I'm putting you on the spot with your plan that you mentioned.
Maybe that's why I didn't show up.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is. But, I also agree with what Rob said, that we really have the opportunity, and you're on the planning board, just like our master plan says, we have an opportunity to create an economic development plan. It may or may not work out, but at least it behooves us to really look at possible opportunities to create more business, so the whole burden doesn't fall on the residential taxpayers. And that also takes us away, hopefully, from that the pie is this big, and how do we divide it into so many pieces to, hey, we are now working to make that pie a little larger.
And I believe Chris, mentioned, a couple, possibilities as far as the solar farms and stuff like that, generating revenue. And, with a small town that we have, obviously there's only so many things we can do to bring in outside revenue. And that's, that is one area that is definitely looked at right now, as doing that. And, down the road, right, what else can we bring in that we can make work in this town, and generate, bless you, generate additional revenue? I guess, we talk about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're looking like to almost have another account set up as like a stabilization fund or a free cash account for the schools. So, if X amount of dollars go into that account every year, and for some reason there's, throw out some numbers, there's $200,000 in that account, well, you did your budget, you need $400,000. Does that now come like, well, they have their own account, let them take out of the account, well, there's only $200,000, they need $400,000. Well, that's their problem now. That's my fear with having a separate account for something. And it gets back into the schools being separate. They're not separate. They're part of the whole town. They're part of our free cash, part of our stabilization fund. Those are funds that we have there to support the whole town. Whether it's something the school needs, whether it's something the fire department needs, the police department. I guess that's the way I look at it from my point of view. So I like the idea. I'm not a fan of it just because I can see the downsides, and that's what my fear is that would happen. And again, it separates from the school having their own fund versus us as a town funding us together as a town.
Yeah, it's not, I hear you, and I think from that perspective it makes sense. If I may offer this perspective, it's not, even if we may have a fund put out there earmarked for educational purposes, it at the end benefits the town as well. Because some of the hardship that we are feeling many years is due to the unexpected fluctuations in some of those mandated lines, and that helps the town. I mean, it didn't really. First of all, it's not easy to explain to the town meeting on the spot what is and what is not, and that's completely understandable. But it didn't really help that we used the word mandated last time we had the special town meeting, because it didn't necessarily mean anything to many folks, because it is not really easy to understand school budgeting with all those legal rules, mandates, requirements, what have you, right? That's why if there is a way to mitigate those ups and downs and say there is a fund earmarked for special education or school choice. Years ago, and Chris probably would know this much better than anybody else, since this was probably there, 15 years on. The school choice based, what do we call this? Revolving accounts. The revolving account. That's what really helped the schools at the time. We still are a net receiving town in terms of school choice. So there are more students coming to Granby than students going out. Mm-hmm. But at that time, the gap between those two numbers was much wider.
Right.
And the number of students in our district was much larger. So they were able to benefit from those two factors and really take some of that and keep it in that revolving account. And when numbers fluctuated, make up for it there. When the enrollment started going down and whatever was in that revolving fund made up for that gap and it disappeared, that's when we started having these more difficult conversations. And I have no problem really, I mean, this is the way our town functions. I have no problem standing in front of the town meeting and explaining, and I think all of us are feeling the same way. But what makes it difficult is that because, as you said, we're not having these conversations beforehand, we always go with that very dramatic gap in front of town meeting. And, you know, probably a lot of folks are sick of us standing there year after year and saying, hey, you know, this year we have this gap again. This year we have this gap again. This allows us to really have those meaningful conversations beforehand and present something to the town that we can all agree on. And something that you said, we will not all agree on any one of those figures probably. You know, it's a matter of conversation and understanding what is and what is not possible. But it is, to all of us, I think, it is the healthier way of doing this and then going to the town meeting and saying, this is what we decided we're going to propose as a school budget. That becomes our budget then, you're right, it's the town, that becomes our collective presentation to the town.
And I agree, Emery, and I think that's an important part of us sitting down together and talking, because when it comes to the town meeting, the people in the town, and from I feel as being a resident of the town, not someone that sits on the Board of Selectmen, but the people that are up there, I'm expecting the guidance from them to say, you know, these are what's possible, this is how we can do this is what we feel is the best way to do it. But when you sit back there and you have one person saying this, one person saying that, one person saying that, it gets scary. For the townspeople, it gets scary. Well, who do I believe?
Right.
You know, and that's just me, as I say, from someone that's sat in the audience at times, if you will. And that's what I'm saying. So somehow we figure to come together in a certain way, say, look, this is the best thing that we can come up with as a town, as town officials working together, and present this to the town, saying, you know, if there's a better way, we'd have that option. But this is the best thing we can present. And I would hope that, you know, the town would respect that and, you know, and help out the way we can, and the way the town can. My next thing too, Chris, and I'll pose this question to you, is that if we have that fund set up as you talked about, again, that's money that's owned by the town. So how does that money come out of that fund? Would it have to be taken out at a town meeting, or so?
Not necessarily.
Or is that something that?
All depends how you set it up.
Okay.
You could set it up as a revolving fund. And as setting it up as a revolving fund, which would require now a bylaw change, just so you know.
Yep.
It would be, you would identify what goes in it and how it's spent. And then that's how it would operate from then forward. If you do a stabilization fund, it's free money as long as anybody can get a 2/3 vote to take money out of it. That's per Mass General law.
Right.
So, you know, it's a simple majority to put it in, but it's a 2/3 to take it out.
Yep.
So that would be, and also a concern that I'd have, is that we put money into that account, and then when you need it, for some reason, it gets voted against. And now you can't get the money out of the account that you set it up for.
Right. If we go for that, that's a good point. If we go for, say, a certain percentage of free cash used for educational purposes, can it be already included in the school budget and school budget presented with that amount included, or is it different? Because that's exactly what I understand other towns are able to do. I don't know how, I don't know what the rules, regulations, laws around those are.
It wouldn't be available that year, probably, or probably the subsequent year, whatever the balance is in it from year to year. Okay, like say we're able to put 200,000 in it.
Yep.
Let's use that for a fact. So free cash gets certified. We then appropriate at town meeting, simple vote, 200,000 from free cash to special or education revolving fund, whatever you want to call it, whatever the name ends up being. That money is now available to be spent at that point in time, once the vote is taken. You just can't include it and say, well, we know we're going to have this, because I don't know where free cash is going to be sometimes. So it would be hard for you to budget a number
Right.
without actually knowing what our free cash number is.
Right.
And a lot of times, our free cash number isn't calculated until probably January, February.
Yep. So let me ask it this way then. For instance, for us, the approach has been, we take the net school spending, what the state says, this is the minimum you have to spend for your schools. We add the $305,000 override to it, right? And then we have all the conversations in front of the town meeting to see whether or not the town would agree to add to it.
Correct.
So a town, and I named enough, some of the towns, so any town that has an X amount that the state says this is the minimum you have to spend, they take that, but the number that they present to their town meeting is much more than what that minimum amount that the state tells them. And they present that to the town. How are they doing it without having the town approval?
They're just spending free cash. Part of the funding source is free cash on an annual basis. That's all they're doing.
Okay, so we can actually take maybe a portion of free cash and put it in the budget and then present it to the town, and the town says,
Yes.
maybe your budget is too much, and
Because it would be identified so much from tax levy, so much from free cash, so much,
Okay.
like we've done in the past. Okay, you just identify the funding source.
Yeah,
Okay, and it's just, free cash is just a simple majority vote. It's not a 2/3, none of that stuff. It's just like, when you fund it with tax levy, it's a simple majority vote.
so,
I've got to ask a question. I'm getting a little bit confused. It was mentioned very early in the meeting that the selectmen had told you to see if you could sharpen your pencil on revenue,
Yes,
and that you were saying that 200,000 on top of the 305.
yeah, so it's 505.
When we're talking now, or in the future, when we're talking this fund, are we talking in addition to that 200,000, or is that,
That number has to be, well, the question is this. That number is a moving target based upon what our actual receipts are the year before. If people now aren't buying new cars, they're holding on to their cars, motor vehicle excise reduces. We have a meals tax. If all of a sudden people aren't spending their money in town on meals, that could go down. It's those type of things. We're lucky right now, we have a lot of houses being built in town. We have a lot of repairs being done. Those are generating fees. If any of that stops, those fees drop. But I have to base it upon my 19 number is based upon my 17 receipts. That's the problem I run into. I can look at where we are in 18 compared to 17 at the same time and try and make a determination of where we can maybe squeeze money out. But if we're running low, I can't. Okay, and that's the problem I run into. Now, to answer your question, Bob, this number, this 200,000, is good for this year.
not for...
Not permanent,
necessarily-
not permanent. It's
and it
good
might
for
very
this,
well be
it's
the
good
amount of money that could be funneled into their,
next year, or maybe the year after, maybe the third, fourth year, maybe not, I don't know.
okay.
But if I'm also being directed to plan revenues to generate a certain amount of free cash for use in a subsequent year, that's going to affect that number,
Oh, yeah.
okay?
I just
There's
wanted
going to
make
be a
sure that
one-year
my memory
hit
was
somewhere down the
realizing
line
that.
that I have to generate it. I may have to reduce that, or I may have to increase expenses. That's the problem that I'm going to run into. If I'm told to make sure I generate $300,000 in free cash every year, that's going to be affected in how I budget, okay? And everybody's going to have to understand there'll be a one-year hit regarding that, okay? And that's all I'm trying to say. But yes, Bob, the 200's good this year. Next year, we're at ground zero. We're back to the 305. And actually, I made a proposal to the Board of Selectmen. Went through, and after we had our meeting, I went through and looked at the CPI. And I took the 305 from 2004 and applied the CPI up through 2017. And the 305 became 398, just using the CPI factor. The board was willing to increase the 305 to the 398, but now I was able to find the 200, so now it's 200, not just the additional 95,000 or 93,000. But they were agreed to apply the annual CPI factor to that number and have it be incrementally increased year after year after year. Now, if we find more in revenue, we'll apply that towards that instead of just increasing it by the CPI.
And it's all good, what I'm trying to understand, that maybe it's simple, I'm missing it. When we present the budget to the town meeting, will we present it inclusive of, whatever
200.
additional amounts?
Right now, it'll be inclusive of the 200,000 that that the board asked me to look at, and I was able to
Okay.
comfortably increase the revenues by.
How about that, for instance, if there, you look at some percentages out of free cash, this and that, would that be included to the presented amount, or does it have to be presented as a separate item?
What it would end up being is we would know that we're funding the school instead of at 8.3 million, the town is funding it at 8.4 million, 8.5 million, okay? With the funding source being so much from tax levy, so much from free cash. Because we have to identify the funding source for DOR purposes, so when we're setting our tax rate, they know that we're using free cash to basically fund an operating expense. It's the way the forms are filled out on the tax rate recap, that we have to identify that funding source.
So I guess, I'm just trying to listen to what you're saying, Chris, so, and these are just numbers and examples, so I think we were at, was it 602?
682.
682. So if you talked about the 200,000 that you were able to come up with, and for instance, Emery, so instead of a couple of things you talked about, I think were like $70,000, and that came, you took that away, would we be asking the town for an additional, $402,000 or additional $602,000?
400.
400,000.
402,000, if they eliminate positions.
Would the Smith vote warrant article influence that?
Influence what, the 200,000?
No,
No.
not the 200,000, the shortfall.
No,
In
it
other words, I
shouldn't.
haven't looked to see what the funding source was for,
Tax levy,
from tax levy.
or tax levy and local receipts, yeah. As you know, tax levy isn't just tax levy, it's state aid taxes and local receipts.
So it's not involved in the calculation of the shortfall.
No.
And I guess my next question would be, Chris, would be, over the past several years, have we increased the amount of money that we've been putting into free cash, our stabilization fund and stuff like that? So, in other words, if in, 2016, we had $100,000, well, in 2017, we were able to put in $125,000. Are we steadily increasing? And I guess, like you said, that kind of goes by, the revenue that the town is generating in taxes, fees, people buying new cars, excise tax, so on and so forth. To me, is that, if that's something you can look at, say, well, next year we should be able to have an additional $100,000 should be going in. I'm just throwing out numbers. Does that make it easier to say to the town, well, we're predicting next year X amount of dollars should be coming additional to what we put in this year, so that could offset the $400,000 that we're asking to take out of free cash?
Tough question to answer, because we have 3 stabilization funds. We, for instance, in FY18, for the general purpose stabilization fund, we put in about 230,000, but yet town meeting, I think, voted 395 out of it for this year's budget.
Yeah.
Reduction. We spent more than we put in. Municipal Building Stabilization Fund, we put in 230,000. That hasn't been appropriated out, but that fund, as I explained to you before, instead of having to borrow the final 10% of the town's share for the elementary school project, I'd like to be able to use the stabilization fund to save the increase in taxes. That's what I'm trying to do with that money. So I'm trying to hold that sacrosanct if I can, because we'll know by probably December of 2018, when the school is fully commissioned, what our true costs are gonna be, because we should be audited by then, should be fully commissioned, we should know what all the final costs are. If we can do that savings and not have to borrow that final 10%, that's good for the taxpayers.
Yeah, I agree.
And we can show that we did our job by trying to save that money. The other fund is the Capital Needs Stabilization Fund. We put $230,000 in that. However, back in, I think it was 2007, 2008, we had a subcommittee, or a ad hoc committee, that reviewed the capital needs of the town. And based upon their analysis, and John LaBera was the chair of that, they say we should be putting $500,000 a year in a capital needs account to cover a replacement schedule for all our capital equipment and to fix our roads,
Yeah, that's,
okay?
I can't agree with the roads thing. It's, nobody's spending their own money on roads.
But I'm just saying, that's what was said. I'm just saying what was said, Mark. You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
disagree, you can agree, it's up to you. Every time the Capital Improvement Committee meets and approves a purchase of a vehicle, purchase of whatever, and they say to borrow that money, I use that Capital Needs Stabilization Fund to pay the debt service as we're slowly paying down the debt over 3 to 5 years. That's what that money I'm using for. So yeah, it may show we have 1.5, but I may have maybe $500,000 scheduled for payment out to cover the debt for the future years, so I really only have $1 million. Okay? That's the problem that I run into, is that I don't know what's going to be approved at capital improvement for equipment replacement, which will affect the balance in that capital needs stabilization fund.
And that fund is averaged out over the last 5 years at $300,000 a year. So if the 500,000 number is correct, it should have been increasing by 200,000 a year to
Right.
take care of
Right.
when it hits the fan.
I would say that $500,000 figure is bunk. To assume that towns are gonna assume the responsibility for fixing their roads is just.
But the problem becomes is this, Mark, is again from the state. Originally, the state was borrowing $300 million a year for allocation out to the towns under the Chapter 90
now they're
program.
down to
Now they're down to $200 million, okay? You're $100 million short. How are we going to pay to maintain our roads in the manner that we're trying to maintain them when we have less money from Chapter 90? And the cost of asphalt goes up, just like everything else, it's all tied to oil, it's all tied to steel, it's all tied to the world economy. And we're trying to make do with lesser money on Chapter 90,
Yeah, like
and the roads are slowly falling apart.
like everybody.
And we see it on the state roads, you see it on the federal roads, you see it on everything, you see it on the bridges. Drive 91, drive the Mass Pike, drive any of these roads.
It's true, I don't think that, we're not gonna be able to save the money I don't think it's feasible for us to try to save the money for something where the state has cut 1/3 of their contribution out. I mean, it's just not, it's gotta be a statewide solution to that.
Right, it has to be a statewide solution, but if the state doesn't increase the funding, are we just gonna let our roads fall apart? Are we gonna go back to dirt roads? Are we gonna go back to tar and stone? What are we gonna do to try and save money to just try and maintain these roads? Because you won't be able to afford using asphalt. It's just a fact of life.
Yeah, they already pulled the money out of the schools, so but, there's some things I think that solutions are really gonna be at the state level. And
Right.
I think one of the assumptions on that committee was erroneous, is that we're somehow responsible for, things that the state pay for. I mean, they can shift certain amounts of stuff on us, but the idea that we're gonna be able to cover all your responsibilities of the state, I don't find it.
Well, it started at the federal level. How many grants did you have available on the federal level 3 years ago, 4 years ago? You had a lot more than what you have now.
Yeah, we do.
They cut it. They expect the state to pay for those federal mandates. State can only raise so much money. They no longer can afford it. Now it falls down to the town to follow those federal mandates. It's the same idea with Chapter 90, Mark. The federal government cuts their spending, state cuts their spending, but we're still required to meet it. Look at the requirements for EPA. We have to do the stormwater pollution protection plan for all the towns, for all the buildings in town. That's going to cost us $50,000 a year to do that, and to be able to maintain what we have to do under those regulations. Everything that you turn around, the federal government is making it tougher and tougher to do business. but yet, there's no money that goes along with it. That's the problem we run into. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
So,
No, you should say it, that's important. It's context that's missing from the discussion, because the feds can pass the buck to the states, and nobody says, oh, it's terrible federal people, federal level. Then the state passes the buck to the cities and towns, and they've been doing that, and they darn well know they're doing that they're sticking us with big bills and cutting our revenue. And they get away with it because we come to town meeting, and we have to fight over it, and then people yell at us because we're not doing things right, because the state hasn't given us the money that the federal government has given them. And it's about time people know that. They've been getting away with that for 30 years. So you should have said
Just
that.
catching on.
No, we've known this for quite a while, it's just that nobody says too much about it.
Stuff rolls downhill, we're downhill. and there's
We're
a
at
lot
the
of stuff
bottom of the
wrong.
hill. We're at the bottom of the hill, so.
I'd give people a lot of credit. I think a lot of people do realize that, and they see it in their own lives, regardless. And, how many times you hear the state predicts to have X amount of dollars for revenue, and then, oh gee, we're not gonna have that, sorry. So they wanna start cutting things, cutting things. Well, we know we promised the town $100,000, well, we can't give it to you, sorry. And, I know it happens. I think a lot of people realize it happens.
But yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Correctional.
And to be honest with you, right now you got this thing out there to reduce the state sales tax to 5%. What do you think that's gonna have on state revenues? Who's gonna have to make that up? Us.
That's the exact point I'm making.
Yeah, it's just, that's the frustrating factor when we sit here, when I sit here and try and put together a budget, and I just see shrinking state revenues, because, it's agreeable that retailers want to reduce sales tax because they're trying to fight the internet sales business. Well, turn around and just say, you have internet sales, you have to pay the mass sales tax, period. That's the way you're gonna solve that issue. But,
So what else do we need to do here before?
so it seems that based on what I'm looking at, the DOR site, their now colorful version, looks like we have done a fairly good job keeping our stabilization fund balance on average the last 2, 4, 6 years around $4 million. So,
trying.
yeah, we're trying and, doing a nice job. So, I guess the conversation is, and we take free cash and put it into stabilization, right? Part of the reason why I asked how we're going to be presenting the budget to the town, our free cash conversation is typically part of a special town meeting in May, before we have any conversation around any budget, right? Budget is in June. So the reason why I brought that up, are we going to be able to present the town a budget that is potentially inclusive of anything that may come from the free cash? And how are we going to do it if those two votes happen at two separate meetings?
It isn't gonna happen. Not this year.
So we're not going to get anything this year.
Well, this year it's going into the school roof.
Most of it, but I had 28,000 going into general purpose stabilization fund to try and put money back in that. If the board decides to ask for a no vote on that, that would free that money up for budgetary use.
What is it again?
28,000.
Okay. So what is it that then, based on, you asked whether we would be happy with you getting involved in this, what is our expectation?
Me getting involved with what?
That
Or the board,
that
the board,
percentage.
the board, you're saying the board, not me.
Yeah, the boards, you asked all of us whether or not we would have you look into the possibility of using a certain percentage of available funds for the schools. So we're not talking about this year, we're talking about possibly starting next year, is that what we're saying?
We have until May 14th to make that decision.
Okay.
Because then I have to have the actual motions ready
Okay.
as to, for the warrant that was signed Tuesday night. Right now, we just have a warrant article warning the voters of what's going to be addressed. Come that night, the board could ask for a no vote on the money going into stabilization fund. I personally think we should keep the 1.4 million going to the roof and the ventilating system and the skylights here.
Yeah.
That's my own personal opinion. The board can disagree with me, but it's their decision how they want me to present it.
You know, Chris, and I agree with you, because I can, as much as we talk about education being important and people, leaving our district, you have kids that are coming to school and parents that are coming here, and the kids are going home saying, well, the roofs are leaking, this is happening. That's not a good feeling for, someone that's home saying, well, gee, I pay all this money for taxes, and I have my kids going to school, sitting in the classroom, and the roof's leaking. And reality is that presents a negative impact where people start, well, if they're not gonna, maybe we should look at moving out of town. And I'm just, theorizing things, but those are, both sides of the coin are very important, where, it's the structure of the building, but also what happens inside the building, as far as the education
Right.
for the students.
But it seems that we're not gonna be able to really add much to what's inside. And that was, that's what I'm trying to understand, what that means. And it's a good thing that we have, I don't know, another month or so, maybe a little less, to have a conversation until the warrants are signed.
No, they're already done.
Hmm?
These are the
The
motions.
warrant is signed, it's the motions,
Motions.
when the
Motions,
motions are
okay.
done. Because the motions can be written up to 2 minutes before it's presented on the town meeting floor.
Okay. Also, we have a capital stabilization fund. So it's good that we have this $1.4 million in free cash this year, and we are now talking about spending all that amount, or whatever, a percentage of that amount for the roof, whatever the bid comes in. But also for capital expenses like that, we have a stabilization fund. So I agree with you in essence that it's important outside, it's important inside. But remember that when we submitted the capital spending budget, that included the roof. It was 3 years ago at least, right? Judy was here at the time. And then we deferred it, we moved it out. So we are at a point where there is a capital need, and typically for those capital needs, we'll look at what's available in the stabilization fund as well. If we're gonna say we're gonna keep that stabilization fund for capital needs intact, but take everything that is in free cash and use it for a capital need, I'm kind of struggling to understand then where we're gonna find those additional funds that we're talking about since the beginning of the conversation, of this conversation.
Can I just amend a little bit of what you said about
Sure.
prior appropriations for a school roof?
Yeah,
About 4 or 5 years ago, we had put in 1.1 million to replace the membrane roof. Ken Scully got up at that meeting and said,
this one, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay,
Ken Scully got up and said, no. We had Rivet come in, and they're gonna patch it. The patch will last 5 to 6 years for $125,000. Town meeting voted the 125 instead of the 1.1. Okay? So, here we are 5 years later, the patch is failing. Yeah, it lasted 5 years.
yeah. No, you're
But
right.
now, so I have put forth in a warrant, 1.1 to replace the whole membrane on this thing. It didn't deal with the skylights, didn't deal with the ventilation system, but it did deal with the membrane. And it was, not you, a school member or a school employee who stood up and said, no, we'd rather have patch it for 125,000. So I have tried in the past to try and put stuff forward, but sometimes to no avail.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest with you, I had a conversation with Cheryl one day at my office. I read your NEASC report from 2014, microscopes for the high school. He can't get new microscopes because, and he blamed administration in the report. Why isn't that brought forward as a capital need?
Right.
So we can have current microscopes instead of ones from the dark ages for these kids to learn on. Okay? I don't have a problem bringing stuff forward.
Yeah. Well, let me add something to that then, since we have the opportunity now. We've been talking about the technology budget for a while. And we looked around at other towns, what they are doing with their technology expenditure. Many of them, maybe most of them, potentially large majority of them, they actually get that money as part of capital, their capital budget. And I don't think in our town we see that as a viable capital expenditure.
Computers. When we had DOR come in back in 2006, they met with the Capital Improvement Committee. And at that point in time, they said, Capital Improvement Committee, capital improvement projects do not include computers. Never mentioned infrastructure, never mentioned any of the other stuff. We had that conversation also on how you present it. Don't present it to increase your computer capacity. It's infrastructure. We rely on technology, internet access. We need to go from a Cat 1 cable that we have now to fiber. That's how you have to present it, because you have such a large volume or need for a capacity, broadband. If every student decides to get on a computer and have to do his homework by searching the web to get his answers.
Right.
Present it.
Yep.
Present it that way. And that's all I'm saying, Emery.
Yeah.
A lot of it is how you present it, too.
So let me go on this tangent then.
No,
This
I'm not
is-
going on any
this
tangents
This
anymore.
is good, this is good advice, and that's why, these collaborative meetings and these conversations are good. We, many times, just put together something the way we think, is the way to present it. And, you're offering suggestions or advice that we don't know until our proposal is rejected, right? So this is good. This is good to know. Now, having learned the lesson, we can go that way and say, because it truly is. It's not really computers. He's not here for some reason. He's usually here till 11 o'clock every night. But Dave gets most of our computers as donations. And, he's been doing it for years and years. 99% of our computers in our district are donations. So we have been lucky to have that. But also, what I mean, nothing included in our technology-related capital budget proposal was inclusive of computers. So maybe it's on us. Now we can go and present it the way you suggest.
But you also have to put out the NEASC reports, too. I didn't even know what it said until I asked Cheryl for a copy of it. I finally read the 150 pages of it, and a lot of it was, they blame administration. They're not getting the equipment that they need in the
Right.
classroom to teach. They blame administration.
Yeah,
Okay, you need new microscopes so these kids can work with current equipment? Put it through as a capital. It's gonna be a useful life of more than 5 years. It's probably gonna cost more than $25,000 to replace the number of microscopes you're probably talking about replacing. Let's look at it. Let's go down that road.
all right. So that's
You
something
know,
else we can look at.
I don't know, do you need something in your physics lab or chemistry lab? It's something to teach the kids so that they can go out to a college and not be behind the 8 ball. Those are the things you have to try and bring forward.
No, that's good advice.
And like I said, if I don't
We'll do
see
that.
the reports, I don't know what to look at, to be
Yeah.
honest with you, okay? If you can just try and share that report, so at least I can read it.
Yep.
I don't think my board members want to read a 150-page report.
These guys do.
Yeah, they,
But I'm just saying
I'll take
is,
2 of them. You
I
put the other
can't
148.
work in a vacuum, I can't work in the dark.
But I do believe that part of the capital request that Judy put forward was the renovation of the science classrooms, which included,
I don't remember that one. All I remember
Yeah.
of that was brought
So
forward
I-
was bathrooms and other things. I don't remember the science
Yeah.
classroom being
no,
brought
it
forward.
definitely included the science classrooms, so,
It may have been part of a 5-year plan,
Right, and-
but it may not have been presented as an article that they wanted.
right. And so
Okay.
that's, what I'm hearing is if we can communicate about what specifically the requests are so that they are written and explained in a way that maybe we're doing a better job, that, we've never asked for in capital, since I've been here anyway, computers, it has been infrastructure, server closet switches, so that we can expand the broadband capacity of kids, getting online, because we are going to have all of our kids taking MCAS online, 7 and 8, and definitely in 10. So, learning, with you, I think, to present those, I appreciate that.
Seems like an awful lot's falling on me here.
well,
So I just-
Collaboration is good, and we appreciate it.
And we thank you.
You're the administrator and the worker.
I'm just not sure where we're leaving off with this shortfall right now for 400,000, I think is where we're sitting.
Well, it'd be about 400,000 if you eliminate the curriculum director and the
Data manager.
data manager,
Yeah.
or whatever you called him.
Yeah, that's what we call it, yeah.
But yeah, that's where we're at right now. Now, if the board doesn't want to put that 28,000 in the stabilization fund this year, it opens it up to be able to be put towards the school budget. Don't know. That's the call of the Board of Selectmen on how they want to deal with that.
So, is it fair to say that we don't have the specifics tonight?
Oh, no.
Right. So that, this conversation will have to continue, so that we better understand how the numbers are shaping. Where we left it off, we see that it's about, $400,000 potentially, and we have to start the conversation from there, whether or not it's possible. So for our next steps, unless there is anything else that anybody wants to share.
You're gonna be wanting to dip into if you're gonna make up that deficit, it's gonna come out of stabilization. I mean, maybe there's other sources and places that things can be diverted, but I don't think there's gonna be a way around asking for money out of stabilization, whether people support it or not.
Right.
So, I mean,
And that's what I'm trying to understand. I mean, it's really this, we knew that numbers are numbers and we're not going to agree on every numbers. But I really appreciate that this is the first time we're having a meeting like this where we are looking for solutions as opposed to saying, nothing is possible. So that's great. But also what we need to do on this side, we know the current size of the gap and we heard some numbers from you folks. Now we have to look at what we do with the rest of it. What is possible, what is not, and we have to do some homework around that and start maybe a new set of conversations around that. In the meantime, Chris, is it that you and Cheryl will meet and talk about what the options may be with respect to some of those additional funds that are potentially available? So,
Which ones?
I don't know. I mean, you remember that conversation earlier we had that? You said, do these boards allow me to look into what may be available? So we said, yes, Chris?
But I don't think that would occur this year, to be honest with you.
Okay.
we already did that this year.
Right.
Yeah, we did the 200,000 already, I went through and did it. If the board wants me to try and go through again, it's just getting to the point where I'm getting a little hesitant about trying to keep increasing revenues with the potential of a potential revenue deficit for FY19. And that's the only concern I have right now.
Right.
My issue is looking at it for next year, try and maybe even create another department called, excess for future free cash or something, and just throw a number in that as part of the budgeting process. And that way it just sits there and knowing that it's gonna go to whatever, or we turn around and say we're gonna create a revolving fund, and that we automatically plan 200,000 or 100,000, 150,000, whatever, to be put in it as part of the budget process.
Yep.
Okay, those are various options to do, because I believe the revolving fund would be a better way of doing it, because that way you identify what goes in and who can spend it. Okay? Where if it's a stabilization fund, the only way you can spend it is through a town meeting appropriation.
Right. That's
Just to be honest with you, that's,
yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's just a matter of really, one, setting up that revolving fund, two, finding the way to replenish that revolving fund. So that's going to be the challenge. So the other thing, I guess, is, this is my personal plea, to see if we can look at the available capital stabilization fund, at least for partial funding of the roof, so that something may be out there available still from the free cash that we're generating, that will put in some non-capital stabilization that can be taken for and used for educational purposes. Because if we take all 1.4, 1 point whatever, 1.1 of it, 1.2 of it, whatever the bid comes in, then we can't take money out of capital stabilization fund for educational purposes, right? Or at least we don't want to. It has to be a series
Well,
of
if you can get
transfers.
2/3 of town meeting to agree with you, then yeah, it can be used for that.
But at least in principle, that's what we try not to do, right?
Correct.
And the free cash, if we can say, instead of using whatever is in free cash for a capital project, if we can use the existing capital stabilization fund for the purpose it was intended for, then maybe part of that free cash can go to one of those stabilization funds that is traditionally used for, supplementing school funds and all that. So at least that there is that effect, that it doesn't look like we are dipping into some stabilization funds that were not really earmarked for capital expenses and some other stuff. They are for general purposes, and we can go and look at those.
I just don't know where we'd be as far as the new roof. And we kind of talked about it, what we did 4 years ago. We came up with a patch for it. So what we did,
Well, not at all. We're not really suggesting that there
But-
should be a patch at all.
no, but we pushed that down the road.
Yeah.
So now we're here again, so the town spent that $125,000. We still need to put a new roof on.
Yeah.
The roof's costing us X amount of dollars more than it would have cost us 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
So my fear is that, okay, so we fix this part of the roof, and we'll push the other part down the road.
Yep.
So now down the road, we pushed it, now that costs us X amount of dollars more because we pushed it down the road. Eventually,
Yeah.
we're gonna,
That's not what I'm saying. I'm probably not doing a good job at this. So we have 1.4 million, a little more than that, in free cash, correct? And we have, I don't know how much in capital stabilization fund. Let's say it's $1 million. That's what we have. What I'm saying is, instead of just using the entire amount of free cash, let's just use part of that free cash, that's fine, but also use whatever is currently in stabilization, capital stabilization fund for the purpose of doing the roof, so that portion of the free cash can be put in a general purpose stabilization fund, whatever we call it, and that typically aligns better with what we do when we need funds for the schools, as opposed to schools now going and saying, well, we're gonna ask for funds out of the capital stabilization fund. It may be a psychological effect, but it's better than going and hitting stabilization funds that are not intended for supplementing any general use,
I mean,
at least to me.
except, there's gonna be somebody probably smart enough at town meeting to say, why are you putting all this money into, stabilization, just to take it back out?
Right.
I mean, I would just like say, okay, we can do it this way, we can do it that way. The money's all coming from the same pot. I mean, the only difference is free cash just takes a simple majority rather than stabilization taking 2/3. I'm not sure that, I think the town meeting could probably understand, it's all money, and it's fungible, that's it. It's one of the few financial terms I know. Doesn't matter where you put it, it's still the same money. I don't know.
The only concern I have with your thought, it's a legitimate question you're asking. If you drain the capital needs stabilization fund for one project, how are we going to replenish it for other future
Yeah,
projects?
and I wasn't suggesting that either. I
But-
was saying,
but all I'm
let's
saying
say
is-
if there's 1 million.
No, I
you
understand
take
what you're saying.
750 of it from
But-
there, and then
but
the rest of it from free cash.
If we get to the point where we're not going to be putting money back into that fund for future capital projects, how are we going to deal with that? Kicking the can down the road again.
Okay.
And that's my only concern,
All
to
right.
be honest with you.
I would just go straight, unless it's like the voting that you're concerned about. I wouldn't go for rhetorical reasons. I wouldn't say we're gonna take some from here and take some from there. I think a simple explanation will probably go farther than the symbolic, splitting of free cash and, capital. Should be municipal buildings, I suppose, but rather than capital.
No, because it's a capital need, it's a capital replacement. You're not rebuilding a building. Municipal
yeah.
building was for construction / renovation of buildings. That
So-
was the original.
So is the roof vote in May at the special town meeting?
At the special, so I can start the process to
catch.
hopefully get the roof replaced over the summer. Try and fast track it, get it out for architectural contract as soon as possible after the vote. Then turn around and be able to have the architect be able to design it maybe in May or probably June, during June, and hopefully get construction going in late July, August.
We're hoping to use slate and like put gables on.
Yeah, that would be good. So the last,
The
the
gym of the
last,
7 gables.
the last question that I have, it is not something that's gonna pay dividends in the short term, but going back to that long term, how do we really plan certain things for revenue generation purposes? And I always come back, primarily because I worked on that master plan. We already had some guidance in that plan that said, let's just look at this opportunity, let's look at this possibility. Can we, and this is your purview, not ours, can we put a committee together that will start looking at the town's needs and what is available out there for us to bring additional revenue to the town? And, if we go in the direction of having members from each one of these committees, we can, appoint somebody or suggest somebody from our committee as well.
You talking about for the financial planning, or the thing that Bob was talking about, or you're talking about something else?
No,
I
he's
actually-
talking about the
Economic Development
Economic
Committee.
Development Committee.
I won't be here then, so it's up to you guys.
You might make a good member then.
Yes, good member.
You might make a
Right
good member
down
then.
there.
I can tell you that I've had many conversations with our farmers in town, and they would definitely want in on that economic development. They're very interested in exploring agritourism.
And
A
I-
lot of positive.
And I would think so. I think, and I think it's important to have some of our business owners in town to be part of that, as well as part of that, committee of having, I think it's definitely something that we should do, and have a committee put together, but also have, not just our committee, but have people from the town, as well as, town, business owners and things like that, because all these different minds coming together can make a difference, and, think about different things. And I know, at the last meeting, someone gave me a couple suggestions that other towns have used to bring revenue in, and they probably would have thought at the time it was, crazy.
Tupperware.
Tupperware was actually, no,
Amway.
it was a certain town where they were fighting with different cable companies to have their own, internet service. So the town went out and did it themselves. Now the town has generated revenue because everybody pays the town money to have internet service versus a Comcast or a Charter or whatever. So those are kind of things that, thinking outside of the box, that's what they did. They came up with the wrong way. Now they generate revenue every from that.
Yeah.
So, those are things, and obviously those things aren't things that are gonna be answered tonight, obviously, and I think reality is, I think that money is gonna end up the need is coming out of stabilization. Because I don't think it's possible to make up $400,000 out of the
Well, in the
school
short term,
budget.
we're gonna have to
No.
consider where, what we're gonna be proposing.
Right.
But this is the long-term thing, the committee,
Right,
and the sooner we start, the better it is,
I agree.
so,
One thing I would think,
yes.
if it does come out of stabilization, you obviously have the problem of a two-thirds vote rather than a majority. I think you need to do a real good presentation of what you will not be able to fund in the event it isn't passed, rather than just talking in platitudes. In other words,
Yeah, agreed.
it's gonna be this teacher, this teacher, this teacher, this whatever, to come up with whatever the amount of money is.
And as
We agree.
more as a resident of the town, not as someone sitting on the board, but please don't paint the doom and gloom picture. Because I think, as you talked about, this isn't what we need. These are the reasons why we need it, to move forward as a town together. And I think, like I said before, I talked about having, you have everybody sitting up there. If everybody up there is on the same page and agreeing on something, I personally think it's easier for the town to not understand it, but easier for a town to say, yes, I can see that, versus, no,
Making it
we
more
shouldn't do this,
palatable
we shouldn't
than
do that.
Gloom and doom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How we're
absolutely.
gonna slash and cut, which is a good possibility, but the situation is that, like Glenn is saying, presenting it totally in a different way. Because I always refer to the pamphlet of gloom and doom, that one pamphlet that you handed out, and it was actually soured me. So, I mean, as a resident, it actually soured me. Like, how bad this is, and instead of presenting yourself in such a manner that, here's where we're at,
Yeah.
we need to turn around and do this, and how are we going to get there? I think that's how much we're gonna slash everything.
I'm actually surprised because our pamphlets usually have these major accomplishments. We try to show everyone how well we are doing, despite the fact that we don't always get the funds that we have. But I think we also try, and that's a great suggestion, that we also try to do the same thing. We say, if we don't get the funds, these are the positions that we're gonna have to,
That
you
are
know,
in
look at.
jeopardy,
Pardon me?
that they're at
That-
jeopardy.
Yeah, they're in jeopardy. So there is risk of reduction. So, yeah, we're gonna do that. I don't think I have anything else, is there? We're gonna adjourn, no. So, I have to tell you this, and that, to build on what you said. Obviously, you guys unfortunately didn't come with the $600,000 to us, but
We came with 200,000.
right. So even the fact that we are able to have this conversation in this form, in this format, and hopefully, you know, folks see it or hear about it, it shows that we all care about it. I mean, we may not be able to do everything that we want to do about it, but at least we all care about it, and that by itself, a game changer to me, because a lot of folks see that we are going at opposite directions and then pointing fingers, and then they say, well, maybe this is not the place where we're going to have schools in the near future, and then, you know, we see the exodus. This is, if for nothing else, it shows everyone that we all care about the schools and we want to do something about it.
And I guess the way I look at it, Emery, is, to me, it shows people that we're committed. We're committed to, you know, we're gonna make the difference, we're gonna solve the problems that are occurring, or try our best to do so, and we're committed to doing that, and we're not just pushing things down the road.
Right.
You know?
And I think, as expensive as it's gonna be, the outlay on the roof is also gonna show that commitment towards the future. You know, with the high school, so we showed that a few years ago with the building of the new school on that side. But with the high school, I've seen the photos of the classrooms upstairs.
And I can tell you firsthand knowledge how many people were upset when basketball games got canceled because of a
Yes.
leaky roof.
Yeah.
And like you said, we're talking about now, hey, we recognize the problem, we need to fix that now. But besides fixing the roof now, we have some other things that we need to take care of as well. And, you know, understandable, it's a lot of money, but again, we need to take care of the certain things at certain times. And down the road, you know, as Chris talked about, we see some future revenue coming in. And also, we're talking about ways of generating other revenue to come in to help us down the road.
Yep.
You know?
I think our side, when we do our presentation, we ought to focus on short-term need for this year, maybe next year with that money, but then talk about what Glenn was just saying. Long-term, we're trying to go in this direction.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We need to do both.
And then that way it's not quite as doom and gloom, right? It's just,
Which is true.
Yeah.
I mean, you do. I mean, I'm not saying, but I look at the big picture, we do have a good school district. I see teachers working hard. I see everybody trying their best. And that means we all have to try our best right here. And we all have, and it is not all gloom and doom. But there are certain, you can't put Band-Aids on this anymore. We need to address it and deal with it appropriately.
Yep.
That's how I'm looking at it.
Agreed. I agree. Anything else? So, thank you all very much. This was a great follow-up to the first one, and it basically, from my perspective, it did meet the hope that we were gonna start building something new, so thank you all very much for that. And we're gonna have our conversations based on what was shared tonight. And chances are we may reach out again for some additional conversation, depending on what we come up with, because we have to really dig deeper now and just look at certain things. Until then, thank you.
And
We'll see you
just
soon.
one last comment, and I can share this because I thought something I think is important. Last week I had a chance to walk down and see the new school and stuff like that. And to walk down there and see different classrooms and see teachers that, taught my children, 5-10 years ago, and to still see them here. And, regardless how, we think the school district is and how things are and stuff like that, but to see the same teachers teaching year after year, I think says a lot, and I think it adds a lot to the students' learning. I mean, that was just impressive to me, to kind of still see the same teachers here after 5-10 years and still know. I had to introduce myself, but as soon as I said who I was, they know who my children were. So,
Yeah.
you don't get that at a lot of places.
They were that bad, huh?
It's a small town education.
Yeah.
Okay, take something good out of it.
Motion to adjourn?
A second.
All's in favor?
All in favor? Aye. All right, thank you, guys.